Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Rafael Vitriago, and today we're going to be determining if the iPhone 15 Pro is up to par with some bigger cameras like the ZV-E10, a small APS-C released back in 2021, which is very popular among beginners and people that want a small budget, and to the ZV-E1, the ZV-E10's older brother, which is a full frame camera and has a lot more punch. Is the iPhone 15 Pro up to the task? That's what we're going to find out. With the announcement and release of the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max, there has been a lot of hype around the new cameras. With improvements both to photography and videography, I think we can figure out why. But for me, I think there's some improvements in some other areas, specifically some specific settings that have been released for videography that make it very interesting for photographers and filmmakers alike. Before we dive deeper into the comparison, let's look at the specs of these three devices. From cheapest to most expensive, we're going to start with the ZV-E10, coming at around $799 in the US and $850 in Europe. It's a very great option for people that are just beginning, who want to experiment in photography and videography alike. Although it is designed to do videography specifically, it's also very good for photographers. That's because you get the famous A64000 sensor inside of the ZV-E10. This is very famous because it's really good for photography. It has a 24.2 megapixel sensor that is very sharp and extremely detailed. Not only does it offer very sharp photos, but it's also a very good sensor for video since it's oversampled from 6K to down to 4K. That means your videos will have extra sharpness compared to other cameras that only have 4K sensor. Today, we're going to be shooting with the Sigma 18-50 f2.8, a $500 lens that is very versatile. It's a very substantial upgrade from the kit lens since it's much sharper and is that f.2 constant aperture. In the middle ground, we have the iPhone 15 Pro. Today, sadly, we don't have the 15 Pro Max, which is the new hype. You know, you have the new 120mm focal length. But nonetheless, we have the 3x, which is a 77mm equivalent, and we're going to be testing all the millimeters available from the iPhone and from the lenses that we have. So in this sense, it's better that we have the Pro because we have something more similar to the range that we have on the cameras. The 15 Pro starts at $999 in the US and $1219 in Europe. But you're not going to want to have that 120 gigs option since if you want to re-recording log, which is something very interesting, you're going to need a little more storage. And that's going to set it around $1,100 in the US or $1,350 here in Europe. This sets the iPhone 15 Pro at either the same or a little bit above the price of the previous combo. If you live in the US, it's going to be pretty much the same if you buy the ZV-E10 body and the Sigma 18-50. And in Europe, it's going to be a little bit less if you buy the Sony body and the Sigma lens compared to the iPhone 15 Pro of 220 and 56 gigs. And of course, we have to take into account that this is a phone and it can do a lot of other things that the cameras just can't. Nonetheless, this is a camera comparison, so we're going to be comparing in that specific regard. Now, there are some aspects in which the iPhone 15 Pro shine, even surpassing the little APS-C, and that is in log recording. So, as you've probably heard in the Apple keynote or many other videos on the internet, the iPhone 15 Pro can now record in log, and this is log 10-bit. Why is this important? Log is basically a very flat picture profile that lets you capture a lot more dynamic range and a lot more information into your video. This is very useful in post because you can get as much detail and you can give the video the look that you want in the end. Now, I know the ZV-E10 technically can record S-Log 3 and S-Log 2, but since it's 8-bit, it's not very useful because it doesn't retain as much color information as it should. So if you try to edit it in post, it's going to break apart pretty easily. Now, one aspect where the iPhone 15 Pro shines is stabilization. Stabilization is very good in the iPhone thanks to the action mode option. You can get you can be very shaky, but the iPhone is going to record very smooth content, even if your hands are extremely shaky or if you're in an extremely shaky situation. We're going to be comparing this to the ZV-E10 with the Catalyst browse. and with the ZV-E1's dynamic stabilization, which is also very good. Lastly, the full frame enters the arena, the ZV-E1. This is a beast of a camera, but it also comes at a very steep price. It's around $2,200 in US and 2,700 euro in Europe. As you can see, it's double the price of the iPhone and almost triple of the ZV-E10. This gives a proper professional look, and it's going to give you the best subject separation, which is what a lot of people desire in professional cameras. Although it has a lower resolution picture to both our competitors, since it's only 12 megapixels, this is not very noticeable in the end product. We're going to see comparisons later with zoom in for details, and you're going to see this for yourselves. It's also important to state that with higher price of body, we also have higher price of lenses. That's because full frame lenses have to have a lot more glass in them, which makes them a lot more expensive. There are some full frame cameras that can use APS-C lenses, but at that point it's not very worth it, and you should just stick to full frame lenses on a full frame body. In this case, we have a Sony 24 to 70mm f4, and it's very similar to the Sigma that we have on the APS-C, since the Sigma is 18 to 50, but we also have to take into account that it's APS-C, so that's going to be around similar focal lengths. And f2.8 should be very similar to f4 in full frame. So with that said, let's get into the comparisons. Okay, so let's start the comparison by looking at the ZV-E10 in video. This is normal video, 24 frames per second. There's not a lot of movement, but I recorded this so that we could see things in details. So let's try to zoom in a little bit so that we can see some detail. So here at 250%, as you can see, there's still a lot of detail, especially in the branches, in the trees, even the castle that is very far in the distance. You can see there's a lot of detail. Now let's jump to the ZV-E1 to see how much that retains detail. Okay, so here this was a little bit later in the evening, so there's no sun in like the circle part, as you can see, but nevertheless we can still see the detail in general. I think the colors are very similar as well. Maybe like a little bit of a difference in white balance, but that's not very noticeable in the end result. And let's zoom a little bit to see the detail. Okay, so here we can see at 250% that even though the ZV-E1 looks great, it does have a little bit less detail. It's a little bit less sharpened overall. This is because the ZV-E1 has a 4.2K sensor, and we mentioned that previously. The ZV-E10 has a 6K that downsamples to 4K, so that's maybe why we have a little bit of less sharpening here. But let's go to the iPhone 15 Pro to see how well it holds up to these two very good cameras. Okay, so here we can start seeing the difference. As you can see, the iPhone is going to have overall a little bit more of a different processing to what the Sony camera does. I haven't touched anything, by the way. This is profile picture off on every camera. And for the iPhone, it's the default video settings. As you can see, it's going to be very different the way they're going to do the colors. For example, I think the shadows are very much lighter on the iPhone than on the two other cameras. I think this is normal because they want to try to have a bigger dynamic range in general. But if you want a more like cinematic look, I think darker shadows are going to be better in general. Now let's see the detail. Let's go to 250% to see how it compares. Okay, so compared to the ZV-E10, we have a little bit of a weird result because it's trying to compensate for not having a bigger sensor by doing a lot of sharpening in post. But this just ends up looking weird, like it's trying to sharpen something that it doesn't have, like the detail that it doesn't have. So I think the ZV-E10 looks better in this specific scenario. Now let's compare it to the ZV-E1. Again, in general terms, the ZV-E1 will have more darker shadows, and it's going to have a little bit of more blown up highlights, but this is something that we can usually fix in post to give it a better look. But the iPhone usually has this baked in to the footage, so as you can see when we compare it to the ZV-E1, for example, it's going to have like less blown out highlights, and it's going to have a little lighter shadows. But then again, let's go to 150% to see the details. Now here for me, there's a very big difference, and not necessarily in favor of the iPhone. It has a much more natural look. So iPhone has been having this like over sharpening effect for a long time. It is better with the iPhone 15 Pro than to previous models, but I still feel like the over sharpening effect is a bit much. Now this was at 24mm on all lenses, except the Sigma, which is 18, because 18 times 1.5 is going to be around 24 similarly. So now we're going to compare another focal length. Okay, so here at 70 millimeters, this is 70 millimeters on the full frame. This is going to be around 75 millimeters on my APS-C because it's 50, and it's going to be 77 millimeters on the iPhone. As you can see, again, the ZV-E10 on the profile picture off is looking very good. I think it's very sharp. Shadows are looking crisp, and yeah, let's compare it to the ZV-E1. Okay, so in this instance, for example, I think I prefer the ZV-E1's look. Even though it is less sharp, you can see that the shadows look a little more natural. They're not as dark, and I think this could be attributed to many things. And yeah, let's zoom in a little bit to see the detail. Let's go to 150. Okay, so the first thing that jumps out to me is the difference in sharpness. You can see it on the foliage, for example. When you look at the ZV-E10, there's a lot more detail in the foliage, in the trees, that is very much lost in the ZV-E1. I think for the ZV-E1, you could not get away with like a 200% zoom, for example, because it would look very soft compared to the ZV-E10. But then again, if you see a side-by-side with the bigger picture, I think they both look really well, and they both have a lot of quality. Okay, so now comparing the ZV-E10 to the iPhone 15 Pro. Let's look at this. Okay, so at first glance, you can probably see it's very different. The iPhone 15 Pro gives something similar to what it did previously, which is this like overall softer and lighter look to the shadows, and you can, I think I can notice at first glance the loss in sharpness overall in the foliage. I don't even need to zoom in to see the difference, and that's going to be like a big factor. This is weird since in the previous result, as you saw, there was like an over sharpening effect on the iPhone. I don't think we see that here, and yeah, that's very different. Let's zoom in to 250% to see if we lose detail or not. Okay, so since the iPhone seems to be a little bit narrower, I don't know why, even though it says 77 millimeters, so it shouldn't be that different. I had to do a little bit less zoom to have something equal in terms of framing. Okay, so the first thing that jumped out to me is that the iPhone changed so much in this lens compared to the previous lens. So we can see that there's a lot less detail in the iPhone here. So I wouldn't use this footage, honestly, if it was a video of mine. 250 simply is too much for the iPhone with the telephoto lens. Compared to the ZV-E10, where it's pretty much usable. I think the ZV-E10 looks very good even at 250. Okay, now let's compare the ZV-E1 to the iPhone 15 Pro. Again, the ZV-E1 looks very good, and I think it has a lot of detail. I think when we look at the iPhone 15 Pro in general terms, it also looks really good. I think it actually manages highlights a little better than the automatic setting in the ZV-E1. And I know, you know, this could be very useful for a lot of people. Say you're not a very savvy user, say you don't know how to do a lot of corrections in post. This is a very good result straight out of the phone, and I think it's very usable. Now, let's try to zoom in to see the comparison in detail. I think here it's not that clear. Like, they're both pretty soft, so I think they're both like not very usable at this zoom range, but I think the edge is a little bit to the ZV-E1 in terms of detail. I think it does look better, but again, I don't think I would use any of these at this zoom range because there's a lot of loss of detail. Okay, so if we look at them side by side, the three of them, I think for me it's pretty clear that the ZV-E10 just has a lot more sharpness and natural sharpness, you know, not over sharpening, especially in this telephoto lens. And this is probably because of the 6K downsample to 4K. And basically, I would never zoom in footage of the ZV-E1 or the iPhone 15 Pro. Now we're going to compare moving video with the iPhone, the ZV-E10, and the ZV-E1. Okay, so let's start with the ZV-E10. The ZV-E10, I think, in general, has very good colors. I think it has a lot of detail. This is at 50 millimeters. This is the most it opens this lens. And I think the details are very good. For both the ZV-E10 and the ZV-E1, this footage was put through Catalyst Browse. It's a free program that you can use to stabilize your footage. Although I used it at 1/50, which they don't recommend a lot because it generates a little bit of a jitter effect. Now going over to the ZV-E1, I think we see a little bit of this pattern again, which the colors are, I think, lighter. I think the shadows in general are also lighter compared to the ZV-E10. And I think it looks really good, honestly. Now let's zoom in a little bit on these so we can see how much detail we maintain. I'm not going to zoom in as much. I'm going to do 200 only just to see a little bit of comparison. Okay, so for the ZV-E10 and the ZV-E1 clips, they were both stabilized with catalyst browse, but I recorded them at 1/50 with the shutter speed. So I'm sorry, you will notice a little bit of a jitter effect. I think that's because I should record it at a higher shutter speed. But then again, I would have lost a little bit of that cinematic effect. Now, let's zoom in into both of these footages to see how they look. And finally, here's the iPhone 15 Pro. As you can see, this was not put through Catalyst Browse, obviously, because it does not support the program. But the in-body stabilization for normal video is very good. I think this is very usable footage in terms of stabilization. But there are some other things that I want to talk about. Well, first off, I think there's, again, this over-sharpening effect. I don't really like how it looks that much. It is weird because I think the over-sharpening is a hit or miss. Sometimes it'll be very apparent and sometimes it won't be very apparent. For example, in the previous comparison with the telephoto lens, which is this one actually, I didn't notice that much of a sharpening effect, but here I think I noticed it a lot more, especially compared to the going back to back with the footage. And I don't dislike it that much, but it's not my preference usually for footage. It does look a little bit more saturated. Of course, I can see very clearly that it's very processed footage, and it's not a look that everyone would necessarily like. And one of the bad things of having that built-in processing is that you can't modify it much in post. Okay, so now comparing the wider cameras, I think here it's some of a similar story. I think the ZV-E10 has this much more darker look, and I think it has a lot more detail again. I'm gonna do a little bit of a punch in here to check out a little bit of the detail. Again, this footage was put through Catalyst Browse, and I'm sorry again for the jittery effect. Although I like how the ZV-E10 recorded, even though it was a little overexposed in the sky, I think in this case that was a little better because I have a lot more detail in the street, which is something that the ZV-E10 did not get. I think it's way too dark. I think usually the darker look, I prefer it, but here I think it was a little too dark. Now let's see what the iPhone 15 Pro recorded. Okay, so one of the first things I noticed about the iPhone 15 Pro is, wow, it has a lot of dynamic range. So we can see the sky in complete detail, but we can also see the street in complete detail. So it's kind of like a mix between the ZV-E10 and the ZV-E1 because it doesn't lose as much detail in the street as the ZV-E10 did, but it also doesn't blow out the sky like the ZV-E1 did. This is pretty good. I think it's a very good result from the iPhone, and also the stabilization is very, very good. The only thing, again, I don't really like is if you zoom in, you lose a little bit of detail, but it does look weird because it's like this over-sharpened detail that is kind of blurry when you zoom in into foliage, for example, or stuff like that. Nonetheless, I think this is very good result for the iPhone. Now, before going to pictures, let's look at one of the most exciting things for me that I wanted to look at is log footage. Looking at the footage, I think that the first thing I can notice about the ZV-E10 is it was a little overexposed. This is probably because of the automatic ISO adjustment. So when you record S-Log3, the minimum is 500 ISO in the ZV-E10. So it is a little overexposed, but we can see that the highlights are very blown out. So here I have modified the footage a little bit. So I'm going to show you the before and after. So that's without any conversion. Now I'm going to convert to Sony S-Log3. So here I have modified a couple things. So I have brought down the highlights and I have brought down the shadows. But you will be noticing something. If I zoom in to the highlights, you will see that the color has broken up a little bit. This is because, again, as I have said before, this is only 8-bit log, so there will not be that much detail. And for example, say you wanted to bring down the exposure or bring it up. I think this is simply something that you can't do with this footage. So for example, right now I'm at 0 exposure, but what if, In this specific case, I think it was overexposed. So what if I just wanted to bring it down a little bit? At minus 0.6, you can see that the whole image just turns darker, and this is not very good for the image. Now, let's see what the iPhone has to offer. Okay, so at first glance, I can notice that the iPhone is properly exposed. This, again, was automatic settings. I just only enabled S-Log recording. I didn't do anything. And so let's put the profile. Okay, this is no settings changed. Sony S-Log 3 converter. It looks very good from the start. So one of the things I noticed is that the dynamic range is very, very good. Like right now you can see the sky is not blown out, and you have a lot of detail in the shadows. I think the sky even looks better here without anything changed. And the good thing about S-Log here is that it is 10 bits. So I can, for example, bring down the exposure or bring it up. For example, here I'm at one stop down and it still looks pretty decent. Like over course it looks a little dark. That's because I think it was properly exposed before, but let's try to increase it now. Again, I think there's still a lot of detail here, and I think overall it's going to be more adjustable here because there is much more information within the video. For this part, I wanted to compare some LUTs that I downloaded off the internet. I will link them in the description. I think they're decent. So for example, here we have a LUT trying to copy the colors from the movie Enemy, the 2013 Denis Villeneuve movie. And as we can see on the iPhone, it looks pretty good. I think it very well transmits that feeling that Enemy did. So let's try to do this, but on the 8-bit footage. Here is the biggest difference for me. So as you can see, I think applying the LUT here does not do its service. There's so much loss in quality, and the highlights are too blown out. And this is something that you simply can't fix in post here. And I think overall the iPhone does have a lot more versatility when you want to try to edit footage in post, with the S-Log 3 in particular. Before going to pictures, I want to test two things. I want to test microphone quality real quick between the ZV-E10, the iPhone, and the ZV-E1. Then I'm gonna go with stabilization. That is gonna be real quick. I'm gonna do normal stabilization, and then the action mode against the gyro data put through catalyst browse, and the dynamic stabilization of the ZV-E1. So let's get to it. Reviewing the footage, please ignore the shakiness of the ZV-E10. I did not put it through catalyst browse, and I also did not enable any type of stabilization. Although for the ZV-E1 dynamic stabilization is enabled, I'm not testing stabilization here. It was only a mic test. This is the ZV-E10. This is what the microphone sounds like. This is me vlogging. This is with the rear camera. So this is what the microphone sounds like. I'm gonna move around a little bit. This is me with the ZV-E1. This is what the microphone sounds like. I'm vlogging right now. I think in general, the better result for me is the ZV-E1. I think this is because the ZV-E1 has a front-facing mic and a back-facing mic. So it'll automatically detect what kind of mic to activate. And I think here it activated the one in front of the camera, so that was where I was speaking to. And I think it isolates pretty well my voice compared to the background noise. Now I think in second place, the iPhone sounds really good. It has a lot of my richness of my voice, and it also suppresses a lot of the background noise. And lastly, the ZV-E10 sounds good, but there's a lot of background noise. I can hear my footsteps extremely loudly, and I think I'd buy another mic if I were to vlog a lot with this camera. Okay, so for stabilization without anything active, of course the iPhone in default has something active because here the clear winner is the iPhone. So I really would not use the cameras without any stabilization on. They're pretty much useless. Specifically, the ZV-E10 is just very bad. It's very wobbly, and we can start to see a big problem that the ZV-E10 has for video, which is rolling shutter. So rolling shutter is this weird distortion that objects generate. This is because the sensor is sending too much information and it cannot process it well enough, the body camera. So it will generate this weird like GLO effect on things. I recorded a little bit of a sample so that you guys can see what happens when you try to move the camera real quick, when you try to do a real quick pan. In my specific use case, I don't really notice the rolling shutter, but if you do a lot of vlogs and if you use your camera a lot to do moving things, you will notice this a lot. Now looking at the footage of the stabilization, this is catalyst browse on the ZV-E10 its action mode on the iPhone, and its dynamic stabilization on the ZV-E1. I think ZV-E10 looks really good. Actually, I was surprised. This is shutter speed 1/200. This is the ideal setting for Catalyst Browse. I think it looks pretty decent for the amount of shake the footage had. Now let's see compared to the iPhone. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, this is the first time I've used action mode, and actually I'm very surprised. It looks very good. So one of the things that surprised me a lot about this footage is that the ZV-E10 had to punch in a lot. Catalyst Browse had to do a lot of cropping for me to get a very stable footage. So that is one of the biggest problems about Catalyst Browse. It will indeed crop a lot. But here in action mode, there's not a lot of cropping. What you do lose, and I notice it a lot, is quality. So you can see there's a lot more graininess in the footage, and overall it's just a worse looking image. But I think it's still pretty usable compared to the ZV-E10. ZV-E10 was decent, but I think action mode is just on another league in terms of stabilization. And then finally, the ZV-E1, I think this is not the best contender. I think here the ZV-E1 does a lot of weird movements with weird sudden movements with the camera. We were running pretty fast. This was my friend running, not me. I was holding the ZV-E10 in the iPhone, but we were running full speed. And it looks decent, but I would not use it. I think it looks worse than the ZV-E10 with Catalyst Browse and the iPhone with action mode. Now with that said, let's go to pictures. So looking at the pictures here, the first thing that I noticed is they're all really good results. I think the only one that I can notice a bit of over sharpening and post-processing is the iPhone, but in general I still think they're all really good. But I really like the look of all of these. I think the ZV-E10 and the ZV-E1 are very neck and neck with overall look. I really like both of those. I think the ZV-E1 has a little bit better dynamic range. Now let's try to zoom in to see the comparison better. So here, for example, I zoomed in to see the truck right in the middle of the image. And I think this is going to be the biggest difference here. So in the ZV-E10, we can see the truck pretty clearly. We can make up what the words say. You can look at the letters without a problem. And in the iPhone, it's a lot worse, but it is better than the ZV-E1. I think this is going to be because of that 24 megapixels. It does look a bit better than the ZV-E1 in terms of details, but it is a little over sharpened as well. So if you prefer that over sharpened look to have a little bit more detail, that's good for you. But if you want to have a softer look in the image, more natural, I think the ZV-E1 is better for you. But again, I think the more detail is to the ZV-E10, then second the iPhone, and third the ZV-E1. Now another picture with the wider lenses here. I want to apologize, the ZV-E1 does have a little bit of a crop in. I took the picture in a weird angle for that one. But nonetheless, we can see that they overall all look really good. I actually think overall, if I was going to use any of these images without editing, I would use the iPhones. The colors are very good. Dynamic range is also excellent. I think this is because of the software the iPhone has, and it just looks amazing. Although I would recommend, if you were going to take pictures in a professional manner, I would always recommend just shooting raw and editing in Lightroom. That's what I usually do. So for the overall picture here in picture number 3, I think the ZV-E1 is my favorite. I think the dynamic range is superior to the ZV-E10. And it has a more natural look than the iPhone 15 Pro. Nonetheless, I still think the ZV-E10 is very good, and again, if you shoot raw, you can edit them in Lightroom, which is what I recommend if you want to start in photography. And finally, the iPhone 15 Pro, again with its magical software, it does a lot of things. The dynamic range is one of the first ones I noticed. There's also the sharpening thing. So it will have a lot of detail even if you zoom in a lot. And finally, with the last picture here, I think the ZV-E10 is my favorite. The ZV-E1 looks also really good. I think it has a better dynamic range, so I think the sky is a little bit blown out on the ZV-E10. But I do enjoy the little bit more of a contrasty and punchy look that the ZV-E10 has. I think the ZV-E1 was a little darker than I'd like here. And the iPhone also looks really good, but again, it's that over sharpening thing that I really don't like that the iPhone does. So I think the winner here is the ZV-E10. One thing to note is the subject separation that I talked about earlier. For example, in the ZV-E1, you can see the plant in front looks very blurry. That's the natural bokeh look. compared to the ZV-E1, where it is a little bit blurred, and in the iPhone I think is the less blurred image. I think I'm gonna do another video where I go in depth with more pictures. Be sure to let me know if you want to see that, or if you want me to compare specific things in picture mode, if you want me to compare RAW in all of the cameras, for example. And finally, we have low light performance. So to test this, I decided to record the 3 devices at the same time. I'm sorry for the iPhone's angle, it's a little lower because I don't have a third tripod, but nonetheless, it still works as a test for the nighttime performance. So the way I decided to test this is that I have a light, that's the one I'm using right now, and I turned it off, and I changed the intensity throughout the video. So it's going to start at 100, then it's going to go to 50%, then it's going to go to 25%. Then to 10, then 5, and then finally it's going to be off. We can see that at 100% they all look really good, especially the ZV-E1 I think has the best look here. But even the iPhone has pretty good video at 100% in the lights. At 50, we can see that it's also very similar. I think they're all really good. I think the ZV-E10 is starting to show a little bit of noise, but nothing to be worried about. By the way, I am changing ISO to compensate for the loss of light in each of these shots, except in the iPhone, which is in automatic. Again, lights at 25%, they all still look really good. I think the ZV-E10 still holds up well, and the iPhone 15 Pro does too. Okay, so lights at 10% is where we can start to see a little bit of loss of quality in the ZV-E10. I think the small APS-C sensor really cripples here compared to the full frame sensor. And the iPhone is also starting to do a lot of softening and denoising, which is helping it a little bit, but it loses a lot of quality. At 5%, I think the iPhone is, again, trying to keep as much light as possible by softening up everything. The ZV-E10 is still pretty usable, but again, it's very, very noisy. And the ZV-E1 I think is the best one here. I think it looks really good still at 5% light. Finally, at lights off, I think the ZV-E10 is barely usable. I think it even struggles to focus at some points. The ZV-E1 also struggles at some times, but I think it's the better overall. And this makes sense since it's the full frame camera. And the iPhone is holding up pretty well, but you can see in parts where there's no much white, because I had a white t-shirt, which helps a lot, but in parts where there's no much white, it's very noisy and very grainy. Well, that was it for the comparison. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked it, if you found this video informative in any way, please share it, like it, comment, and subscribe. We're going to be making a lot of more videos in the future. We're going to be comparing many other aspects of the iPhone 15 Pro to these cameras. Be sure to comment below if you want something in specific, and we'll be sure to check them out. Thank you very much for watching. Please be sure to check out my Instagram, r.vitriago, where I'm constantly uploading photos, and soon I'm going to be making more videos. So, thank you again. Bye bye.